There is often a lot in life and along this healing journey that creates uncertainty. And living with that uncertainty can feel incredibly challenging. And today I'd like to talk about kind of where that comes from and what we can do with it. Welcome, I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thank you for joining me. I've talked quite a few times about the experience of uncertainty, and typically I end up talking about that because I'm talking about being able to feel a sense of safety and trust within vulnerability. And so it really can show up in a lot of different ways or areas in our lives. And one of the things where it tends to come up quite a bit within my videos is the video that I did on healing when you don't have clear memories. If that's a struggle for you, make sure to check it out. I'll share a link in the description. But that is a huge area that people tend to struggle with when it comes to not having really clear memories. And that can bring up all kinds of things. And I talked about that in that video. But it really kind of made me think about how generally there is this kind of sense of uncertainty about a lot of things along this journey. And that can show up certainly in terms of memories and experiences, but it can also show up in not feeling certain about how you feel or how you should feel, how you want to feel. So it can be pretty prevalent around emotional feelings. It can show up in terms of boundaries quite often, doubting what it is that you want in a boundary, doubting your willingness or really kind of the ability to feel that you deserve to be able to set that boundary, what will happen as a result of that boundary. Trying new things, risking vulnerability, new relationships, all kinds of things can be affected by the idea of uncertainty or the experience of uncertainty. And if you think about it, you can probably pretty easily connect to what that sense of uncertainty feels like in your body. And sometimes it might be relatively mild. It might be something that you experience so chronically that it almost feels like a natural part of how your body tends to feel. You might have kind of highs and lows with uncertainty. Sometimes it might be pretty intense where you really notice it, or there's a lot of physiological response to it. Or sometimes you might never really get the highs in terms of the intensity of feeling, but kind of that chronic sense of always feeling unease, uncertain, fearful even. So that sense of uncertainty is two things, generally speaking. It's fear, which is connected to anxiety, which is what that is about. And it can also be about the unknown in that thing. So with the idea of boundaries, it could be what is going to happen? What are people going to think? Am I going to regret it? And so that creates a lot of uncertainty. It creates fear. And ultimately, it typically, until you've been able to do some good healing, it will keep you from acting on it. But an interesting thing about that sense of uncertainty that can show up in those times is that the uncertainty isn't really about doing the thing. So the uncertainty isn't really about setting the boundary. The uncertainty is about all the things that we fear around it. So it's not actually the act of setting the boundary, it's how will I feel? How will others feel? What will happen? What will people think? Will I regret it? So there's all kinds of fears around that. When you recognize what those fears are around it, then you can address those fears. Because those fears, any of those things that I just mentioned, are likely very similar, if not exactly the same, as fears that come up around other things too. because those fears go along and in a sense reinforce those false core beliefs, right? If you think about, what if something bad happens? What if somebody thinks something bad about me? What if somebody judges me? Those fears probably come up in many areas in your life. And we have those fears. They started, generally speaking, very early in life, in a sense to protect us and to, unfortunately, reinforce those false core beliefs. But when we're feeling that uncertainty, as we're, for example, thinking about a boundary, we think that that uncertainty that feels bad and unsafe is about the boundary. But it's really not. It's about the fear that's connected to the false beliefs. It's about your nervous system trying to protect you from having something erroneously reinforce those false beliefs. So, with the example of setting a boundary, when you can recognize that it's not about the boundary, it's these other things, then you can focus on those other things. You can work on releasing those fears. You can do some reality testing. And if you're in therapy, you can really process what those fears are and work through them and heal them. And the same is true, like I mentioned in that video, a lot of difficulty with not having really clear memories or having a sense but not having any specific memories. Even with that, often there's a fear of not being able to trust yourself. What if I'm wrong? What does it mean? And what does it mean even if it's true? So there are a lot of fears around that. And when you're feeling that sense of unease and uncertainty around not having clear memories, it's often around, what does it mean that I don't have these clear memories? And even with the boundaries, what does it mean that I'm feeling all this fear? Well, in our mind, it means that we shouldn't do it, right? That's what our fear typically tends to tell us, is that when there's doubt about it, if something bad could happen as a result, then it's not safe, therefore we shouldn't do it. And the same thing is true when we are building a relationship, whether it's a friendship or a romantic relationship, or even any sort of real connection. So that could be with a therapist even. But because that feels unsafe, it creates uncertainty. What if this? What if that? And we get caught up in all of that, and it feels that that is the reality, that those things are real outcomes, that those are real outcomes of what is likely going to happen if you do this thing. Now, in all reality, you could have that scary outcome. I'm not going to try to pretend that it's all in your head, because it absolutely isn't all in your head. And you've had experiences that have shown you that bad things can happen, that people can hurt you and let you down. But because of the impact that that has, we continue to hold on to it. We continue to believe it. We continue to expect it, which doesn't really leave room in our mind or even in our heart to consider the real possibility, maybe even likelihood, that something different can happen. And even in the case of memories, we tend to fear what we don't know. Why am I not remembering? What is it I'm not remembering? And we can come up with so many, potentially hundreds of scenarios that we're not remembering, and none of them are good. And it makes us feel pretty bad. It can cause us to think, like, what's wrong with me that I would imagine that this happened? But we fear what it is that we anticipate could be a possibility. But that possibility is that. It's a possibility. When we know what we're dealing with, if we're able to know that, or even if we just accept, which is a part of what often needs to happen, that yes, I believe that something happened and I don't need to have these memories. That is part of the healing, because you no longer then are faced with what did or didn't happen. You accept what you believe to have happened. You accept the reality that things can happen without you having complete memories, or really any memories about it. And when you get to that place, that uncertainty begins to dissipate and really disappear. So I think it can be helpful to recognize, what does uncertainty feel like in your body? Because it definitely creates a sensation. It could be a sensation of freezing. So there may not seem like there's really any sort of actual feelings or emotions present. You might not notice any specific sort of sensation. But freezing is something happening within your body. You might go numb. You might feel cold. You might notice that there's absolutely no physical sensation present. And numb is a feeling. For a lot of people, it shows up in kind of your abdominal area, or with tension, maybe in your shoulders, your back, your hips, or your jaw. You might feel something in your head, whether it's a headache or some lightheadedness. Being able to recognize that sense of uncertainty when it is present for you is important, because when that shows up, you can then do something with intention to help reduce that sense of uncertainty. And why that, part of the reason anyway, why that is important is because when you're on this journey, that uncertainty is going to come up probably pretty often. And it reinforces the fear that it is good to be fearful, that you should be fearful. So if you can, when that uncertainty shows up, however it might show up for you, and it might be different depending on the circumstance or the day, but when that uncertainty shows up, being able to take some time to decrease that level of anxiety that's present for you. When you are intentional about doing that and can dissipate that to a degree, you are retraining your nervous system to respond to uncertainty in a different way. So, for example, one thing that you might do when you notice that sense of uncertainty coming up for you, you can recognize it, and your immediate response might be to try to do something to move away from it. And that's a reasonable thing to do. Most of us, naturally as humans, are going to want to move away from things that are uncomfortable. The thing about being able to heal from trauma generally, and certainly childhood trauma, is that when we automatically move away from it, it continues, in a sense, to control us. I would say in many ways, actually, it tends to control us. So, and generally speaking, when it comes to healing from trauma, from my perspective, the goal is not to ultimately learn what creates uncertainty or triggers or that kind of thing. The goal isn't to recognize that so that you can continuously avoid it for the rest of your life so you don't feel it. From my perspective, the goal is to recognize what difficult things come up for you, and very intentionally and ideally with support, and I think that some of this can only be done with the proper support, being able to be with that sensation. And what I mean by that is not move away from it, consciously or not, staying with that. And you have to have some sense of safety to be able to do that. So that it can take a while in this healing process before you can get to this place. But being able to be with that sense of uncertainty, noticing how it's feeling in your body, being able to stay with that, remind yourself that you are safe, that it's okay. Depending on what the circumstances, you might say different things, but you could say, like in the case of boundaries, you could say, boundaries are healthy. I'm on this healing journey and I'm doing things that are healthy for me. And it's okay if people don't understand or don't agree. It doesn't mean that I'm wrong. So you can do some specific things to help you through it. Now, a lot of you have probably done some of these things and you might be thinking, I've done all that and it doesn't work. And I get it, because in reality, it likely isn't going to work for a little while. Now, there are a lot of factors that play into why it's not working and when it might work. But I can confidently say, for the vast majority of people, I would actually say for all people under the best circumstances, and best circumstances might not be the best word to use there, under good, supportive, healing conditions, I guess I might say. I believe that really all people can get to a place where the effects of it, at least, are much less significant. It doesn't mean that you will never feel it, but when you feel it, the impact that it will have on you will be a little bit different. So in doing some of that self-talk and some of the reality testing, you get to have an experience where your nervous system, and whether it's freeze or flight or fear or whatever it is, you can learn that just because that feeling comes up doesn't have to mean it's a bad thing. It doesn't have to be a scary thing. That you can be with it, you can be with yourself in it, you can talk yourself through it, and recognize that even though those feelings come up, even when they can be pretty significant, that you don't have to run from those feelings. You don't have to push them aside. You don't have to do something that's maybe not so healthy to distract yourself away from them. That it is safe, that you are safe and can be with that feeling. And when we can be with that feeling for a period of time, that feeling begins to dissipate. When you act on it, then it kind of reaffirms that that's how you stay safe. When you just can sit with it, and I say just, but that's not easy. But when that can happen, when you can be with that feeling and talk yourself through it and recognize, okay, I can feel this emotion without something bad happening, that is incredibly healing. It's emotionally healing, it's nervous system healing, and it resets your ability to be able to be with uncertainty, anxiety, doubt, and fear. But I want to be clear, it's not simple. Well, the idea is simple. It's not easy. But the idea is kind of simple because it's what I've just talked about. But you have to practice it, and putting it into practice is not easy, because however old you are, however old you were the first time something bad happened, you've been coping, you've been automatically responding in these ways that entire time. So for many of you, probably a minimum of a couple decades. For some of you, probably several decades. And so it's important to be patient. It's not going to work right away. it's going to take a lot of practice to be able to get there over time. And there will be times that you might be feeling like you're doing pretty well with it. And then you will have a time, and I've talked about how this happens as well. There will come a time, and it could happen for a number of reasons, that your nervous system responds the way it used to. That is part of the process. It is part of why we have to continue to practice. And that time is not a setback. And that's important to remember as well. But we can learn to be with the uncertainty. And when we can learn to be with that uncertainty, it's pretty amazing, really, that we tend to feel less intensity around that uncertainty. And if you think about it, think about how that shows up for you. Self-doubt, fear, uncertainty, whatever it is, shame can bring up a really intense emotion as well, and physiological response. Think about how sometimes suddenly it can come on, and how it just immediately is a tsunami, this rush of feeling. And it's almost as if you can't think about anything else, you can't do anything else. That's incredibly intense and so impactful. And with practice, and I do think the support is important, with practice, you begin to recognize that that doesn't have to be that way all the time. And you deserve to be able to feel a sense of stability, a sense of kind of ease in a sense, even when there are difficult things within going on. It doesn't mean that you welcome it. It doesn't mean that you like it or are grateful for it. It just means that you feel a sense of safety or trust in knowing that while this feeling can be there, you're going to be okay. That feeling will begin to dissipate. And this is one of those things, I know that if you haven't really been able to experience it, that it can be really kind of impossible to wrap your head around what that can really look like or feel like. But if you've been on this journey for, I would say probably 6 months or so, and certainly beyond, you've had glimpses of it. And maybe uncertainty isn't the word that you might use or the experience that might come to mind. But whether it's fear, unease, unsettled, uncertain, there's probably something that you can recognize there. And you really deserve to be able to feel more ease, more trust within yourself and your life. I'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments. If you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe and click the bell for notifications. I'll look forward to seeing you soon.